In her childhood home in Seattle, a grieving young woman was about to discover a devastating betrayal. What started as a simple walk through familiar rooms took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own erasure from family history. Ellie Clark wasn't your typical graphic designer. For 7 years, she had built independence after feeling pushed from her family, known for her fierce determination. When she encountered every family photograph altered to remove her presence, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy. Ellie's search for truth would lead to exposing a predatory network targeting elderly victims. What began as missing photos would become a battle for justice that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The key felt foreign in Ellie Clark's hand as she stood before the front door of her childhood home. 7 years. 7 years since she'd used this key, since she'd walked through this threshold as anything more than a reluctant visitor during brief, tension-filled holidays. The brass had tarnished, and she wondered if Catherine had changed the locks, half hoping she had. It would give her an excuse to turn around, drive back to Portland, and let the funeral arrangements proceed without her. But the key turned, and the door opened into a house that smelled of lilies and expensive candles instead of her mother's lavender sachets and her father's morning coffee. Ellie. Catherine's voice carried that same measured warmth it always had, perfectly calibrated to sound caring while maintaining emotional distance. I wasn't sure you'd make it. Catherine Morrison Clark stood in the foyer like a magazine photograph of the perfect grieving widow. At 45, she maintained the kind of polished beauty that required significant investment. Honey blonde hair styled in an elegant bob, makeup applied with professional precision even in grief, a black dress that probably cost more than Ellie's monthly rent. Her stepmother had always been beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty that felt calculated, weaponized. "Of course I made it," Ellie replied, setting down her single overnight bag. "He was my father." Something flickered across Catherine's face. So brief, Ellie might have imagined it. "Of course. I've put you in the guest room. Your old room is... well, I've been using it as an office. I hope you understand." Ellie nodded, though the words stung more than she expected. Her childhood bedroom converted into office space, another piece of her history erased and repurposed. The house felt wrong as she followed Catherine through the familiar hallways. The layout was the same, but every surface had been reimagined through Catherine's interior designer eye. Gone were her mother's warm earth tones and comfortable furniture, replaced by stark whites and grays that looked beautiful but felt cold. It was like walking through a museum of someone else's life. "I'll let you settle in," Catherine said, gesturing toward the guest room. "The funeral director will be here at 3 to go over final arrangements. I've handled most of it, but I thought you might want to..." She paused, as if searching for the right words, "contribute somehow." The guest room was as impersonal as a hotel suite. Ellie sat on the bed and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the handful of text messages from her father over the past year. Brief, stilted conversations about work and weather. When had they become strangers? When had "How are you, sweetheart?" become "Hope you're well"? She knew when. It had started gradually after Catherine entered our lives, subtle shifts in tone and frequency that Ellie had attributed to her father's new happiness. She'd been glad he'd found love again after her mother's death, even if she'd never quite warmed to Catherine. But somewhere along the way, the conversations had become perfunctory, then sporadic, then nearly non-existent. Restless and avoiding the reality of why she was here, Ellie wandered back into the main house. Catherine was in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones with the caterer about funeral reception arrangements. Ellie found herself drawn to the living room where family photos had always lined the mantel and side tables. The photos were still there, wedding pictures, holiday celebrations, family gatherings spanning decades. But something was wrong. Ellie moved closer, her graphic designer's eye immediately picking up the subtle inconsistencies that others might miss. In her parents' wedding photo, one of her most treasured images of her mother and father, there was an odd crop. The image felt unbalanced, as if something had been removed from the left side. She remembered this photo clearly. She'd been the flower girl, standing next to her mother in a frilly pink dress. But in this version, the dress was gone. She was gone. Heart-pounding, Ellie examined the other photos more carefully. Her high school graduation, where she remembered standing between her parents in front of the school sign. Now her father stood alone, his arm positioned awkwardly as if it had been around someone who was no longer there. A family Christmas morning that she remembered vividly, her father helping her assemble a bicycle while her mother was laughing in the background. The photo remained, but the bicycle was gone, along with any trace of the daughter who'd received it. Photo after photo told the same impossible story. 7 years of Catherine's presence were meticulously documented, but 25 years of Ellie's life had been systematically edited out. Wedding albums showed David and Catherine's ceremony in detail, but the engagement photos that had included Ellie as maid in honor were cropped to exclude her entirely. Even candid shots from recent years had been altered. Christmas dinners where Ellie's empty chair remained, but her presence had been digitally erased. Those are some of my favorite pictures. Ellie spun around to find Catherine standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Where am I?" Ellie's voice came out smaller than she intended. "In all these photos, where am I?" Catherine's perfectly composed face showed a flicker of something. Satisfaction? Relief? "I'm sorry, dear. I'm not sure what you mean."
"This Christmas photo," Ellie pointed with a trembling hand. "I was there. I remember this day. I gave Dad that watch he's wearing, but I'm not in the picture. Memory can be such a tricky thing when we're grieving," Catherine said, her voice taking on a gentle, almost condescending tone. "Sometimes we remember things differently than they actually happen. Grief does that to people." But Ellie knew what she remembered. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her own photos, finding a selfie she'd taken that same Christmas morning. There she was, wearing the red sweater she'd bought specifically for the occasion, standing in the same living room with the same decorations visible in the background. The timestamp matched, the room matched, but in Catherine's version of the same day, Ellie simply didn't exist. "I need some air," Ellie said, pushing past Catherine toward the back door. The garden was another casualty of Catherine's renovation. Her mother's herb garden had been replaced with geometric hedges and expensive outdoor furniture. Even here, Linda Clark's memory had been systematically erased and replaced with Catherine's vision of perfection. Ellie's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Sarah. "How are you holding up? I know today is hard." She started to type a response, then stopped. "How could you explain this? How could she tell anyone that she'd been erased from her own family's history?" It sounded insane, it felt insane, but the evidence was undeniable. Someone had spent considerable time and effort removing her from every visible trace of the Clark family story. Someone with access to the photos, with the technical skills to edit them convincingly, and with the motivation to rewrite history itself. Catherine appeared at the back door. "Ellie, the funeral director is here." As Ellie walked back towards the house, she caught sight of her father's study window. Even from outside, she could see the wall where his business awards and family photos had always hung. She stopped, staring at the display that had once included photos of father-daughter dance recitals, school achievement ceremonies, and proud moments spanning her entire childhood. Every single one had been replaced with photos that didn't include her. Standing in the garden where her mother's roses used to bloom, looking at a house that had been stripped of any evidence of her existence, Ellie felt something shift inside her. The grief and confusion were still there, but underneath them was growing something harder, more determined. Someone who tried to erase her from her own family's history. Someone had spent years systematically removing every trace of David Clark's daughter from the visual record of his life. But Ellie remembered. She remembered being loved, being wanted, being an integral part of this family's history, and she was going to find out why someone needed her gone badly enough to rewrite reality itself. The funeral director's car sat in the driveway, waiting to discuss arrangements for a man whose life story had been edited to exclude his own daughter. But as Ellie walked back towards the house, she wasn't thinking about funeral arrangements anymore. She was thinking about the kind of person who could systematically erase another human being from existence while maintaining a facade of grief and concern. She was thinking about motive, opportunity, and the chilling precision of what she discovered. Most of all, she was thinking about the fact that if Catherine had gone to these lengths to erase her from the family photos, what else might she have erased? What other evidence of Ellie's relationship with her father had been systematically destroyed or altered? The key felt foreign in her hand when she'd arrived, but as Ellie walked back into the house, she realized she wasn't the intruder here. Someone else had taken her place, stolen her history, and tried to make her disappear. But Ghost, Ellie thought grimly, had a way of coming back to haunt the living. The erasure part 2, the funeral performance, the funeral home's chapel filled the faces Ellie barely recognized. These were her father's business associates, Catherine's interior design clients, and neighbors who had moved to the area after Elliot left for college. A life created during the 7 years she'd been absent, populated by people who knew David Clark only as Catherine's husband rather than Ellie's father. Catherine stood at the front, accepting condolences with practiced grace. Her black Armani dress was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless despite the tears that seemed to appear and disappear on cue. She looked every inch the devoted widow, surrounded by an impressive turnout for a man who had apparently lived a full and happy life. But something was wrong with the narrative being constructed around Ellie's father's casket. She overheard her father's farm. Dave was so fortunate to have found love again, she overheard Mrs. Patterson, their former mistress, were telling Catherine. After all those lonely years following Linda's death, you brought such joy back into his life. Lonely years? I had been there during those years. I had been 18 when her mother died, devastated and grieving, but I'd stayed close to my father through college. They had dinner together twice a week. I'd helped him learn to cook, taught her to use social media to stay connected with old friends. Those hadn't been lonely years. They had been healing years, father and daughter supporting each other through the worst period of their lives. Catherine dear, another woman said, taking Catherine's hands in her hands, I know David treasured these past 7 years with you. He always told me that you had given him a reason to smile again. True enough, but it implied that nothing before Catherine had mattered, that 25 years of fatherhood had somehow been incomplete or insufficient. When Catherine stepped to the podium to deliver her eulogy, Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chapel's air conditioning. David was a man who lived 2 lives. Catherine began, her voice carrying perfectly to every corner of the room. Before we met, he was successful in business, but struggling with loneliness and loss. The years after Linda's passing passing were difficult for him. He felt disconnected from family, isolated by grief. Ellie's breath caught, disconnected from family. She'd been right there every step of the way, but David was a man capable of growth, of change, Catherine continued. When we met, he discovered that life could hold joy again. These past 7 years were the happiest of his life. He often told me that meeting me had saved him from becoming a bitter, lonely old man.
The words were carefully chosen, each one a small knife. Catherine wasn't lying exactly, she was reframing, making David's relationship with Ellie sound like an obligation he'd been relieved to escape rather than a connection he'd treasured. David leaves behind a legacy of love and second chances, Catherine concluded. He proved that it's never too late to find your true family. True family. The phrase hit Ellie like a physical blow. She was sitting in the third row, not the first, where immediate family belonged, because Catherine had gently suggested that the front row should be reserved for those who were closest to David in his final years. As Catherine returned to her seat, several business associates stood to share memories. Their stories painted a picture of David as Catherine's devoted husband, a man who'd found purpose and happiness in his later years. One after another, they spoke about David and Catherine's travels, their dinner parties, their shared involvement in local charities. No one mentioned his daughter. During the reception, Ellie approached Dr. Martinez, her father's longtime physician, hoping for a friendly face and honest conversation. Ellie, Dr. Martinez said, but his smile seemed strained. I wasn't sure you'd make it. I know things between you and your father had become complicated. Complicated? Ellie blinked. What do you mean? Well, David mentioned that you'd grown distant over the years. He understood, of course. Young people have their own lives to live, but I know it saddened him that you'd chosen to stay away. The conversation felt surreal. Dr. Martinez had known her since childhood, had treated her for everything from strep throat to a broken wrist. He'd seen her with her father countless times during her mother's illness and after. How could he believe she'd simply chosen to disappear from David's life? Dr. Martinez, I visited Dad regularly until about 3 years ago. We had dinner together. We talked on the phone. Of course, he said quickly, but his expression remained doubtful. I'm sure you did your best to stay in touch. Catherine mentioned that you'd call occasionally, but that David often felt it was more out of obligation than genuine affection. Ellie felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Catherine said that? She was concerned about David's disappointment. She tried to help him understand that children sometimes pull away as they build their own lives. Before Ellie could respond, Dr. Martinez excused himself to speak with Catherine, leaving Ellie standing alone with the horrible realization that the photo erasure was just the visible tip of something much larger. Catherine hadn't just removed Ellie from family pictures, she'd been systematically poisoning the narrative of their relationship for years. Everyone in this room believed that Ellie Clark was the ungrateful daughter who demanded her father, leaving Catherine to pick up the pieces and provide the love and companionship that Ellie had withdrawn. Excuse me, are you Ellie? She turned to find a man in his 30s with kind eyes and a concerned expression. He wore a well-tailored suit, but carried himself with the careful professionalism of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. Yes, I'm sorry, do we know each other? Jake Rodriguez. I was your father's attorney. He glanced around the room, then stepped closer. I wonder if we might speak privately after the service. There are some matters regarding your father's estate that I think you should be aware of before the official will reading. Something in his tone sent a warning signal through Ellie's grief-fogged mind. Is there a problem? Jake's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the flicker of concern in his eyes. Let's just say there are some aspects of your father's final arrangements that I think might surprise you, not all of them pleasant. As Jake melted back into the crowd, Ellie stood surrounded by people who'd been convinced she was the disappointing daughter who'd abandoned her father, leaving Catherine to pick up the pieces and provide the love and companionship that Ellie had withdrawn. But Jake's words echoed, matters that might surprise you, not all of them pleasant. The photo erasure, the poisoned relationships, and now mysterious problems with her father's estate. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more terrifying than Ellie had imagined. Catherine hadn't just rewriting history, she'd been positioning herself as the only person who truly mattered in David Clark's life, while systematically destroying any evidence that his daughter had ever been anything more than a disappointment he was better off without. The Erasure Part 3, the will reading revelation. Jake Rodriguez's law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Elliott Bay that would have been impressive under different circumstances, but as Ellie sat across from the mahogany conference table, watching Jake arrange documents with obvious reluctance, she couldn't focus on anything beyond the growing knot of dread in her stomach. Catherine sat beside her, perfectly composed in a navy business suit that probably cost more than Ellie's monthly rent. She'd brought her own attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Sterling, that radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning unwinnable cases. Before we begin, Jake said, his voice carefully professional, I want to acknowledge that some aspects of your father's final arrangements may come as a surprise. Estate planning can be complex, especially when family dynamics change over time. He was being diplomatic, but I caught the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided direct eye contact with Catherine. Whatever was coming, Jake didn't like it.
The will itself is straightforward, Jake continued, opening the blue-bound document. David Clark, being of sound mind and body, has made the following bequests. The reading began with small gifts to longtime employees and charitable donations that sounded like her father's voice. Then Jake reached the substantial assets, and Ellie's world tilted sideways. To my beloved wife, Catherine Morrison Clark, I leave the family home on Mercer Island, my ownership stake in Clark Import-Export, and the entirety of my life insurance policy, valued at $2.3 million. Jake's voice grew quieter. To my daughter, Eleanor Clark, I leave the sum of $5,000. $5,000! The number hung in the air like an insult. Ellie's mother's jewelry, her father's business that she'd grown up understanding would one day be hers. The house where she'd spent her childhood. Everything went to Catherine. Everything except a token amount that felt more like dismissal than inheritance. There's also a letter, Jake said, producing an envelope. Your father requested that this be read aloud during the will reading. Catherine's attorney nodded approvingly. Please proceed. Jake opened the envelope and began reading in a voice that grew increasingly uncomfortable. My dear Catherine, if this letter is being read, then I am gone, and you are hearing my final thoughts about our family. I want to explain my decisions regarding my estate, particularly as they relate to my daughter, Eleanor. Ellie's breath caught. Her father had never called her Eleanor, always Ellie, since she'd been old enough to express a preference. Over the years since our marriage, I have come to understand that Eleanor made a conscious choice to distance herself from our family. Despite my attempts to maintain our relationship, she consistently prioritized her own life over our connection. Her infrequent visits and obligatory phone calls made it clear that she viewed me as a burden rather than a father. The words felt like physical blows. This wasn't her father's voice, wasn't his way of thinking or speaking. David Clark had been direct, but never cruel, disappointed, but never dismissive. Catherine, you showed me what it meant to have a true partner, someone who chose to be present during the difficult moments rather than absent. You gave me 7 years of genuine happiness, while Eleanor gave me years of watching her pull away until I barely felt like her father at all. Ellie's hands clenched in her lap. She remembered those years differently. Remembered being the one to call, to visit, to maintain connection until something had shifted around the time Catherine entered their lives more permanently. Therefore, I leave my estate to the woman who truly became my family, trusting that Eleanor has already moved on to a life that doesn't include us. Jake folded the letter and set it down, his discomfort obvious. That concludes the reading of David Clark's last will and testament. The silence stretched until Catherine's attorney spoke. I believe this clearly outlines Mr. Clark's final wishes. Are there any questions about the estate distribution? Yes, Ellie said, finding her voice. I have questions about everything. The language in that letter doesn't sound like my father. The timeline doesn't match my memories of our relationship. Victoria Sterling's smile was razor sharp. Grief can affect memory, Miss Clark. Sometimes what we remember isn't quite accurate. But Jake cleared his throat. Actually, there are some aspects of the estate planning timeline that I find unusual. Several key documents were amended in the final 6 months of Mr. Clark's life. The original will, drafted 5 years ago, had a very different distribution of assets. Catherine's composure flickered. David changed his mind as our relationship deepened. That's not unusual for a man who felt increasingly distant from his daughter. Perhaps, Jake said carefully, but the changes were extensive and occurred during a period when Mr. Clark was dealing with medication changes for his heart condition. I have concerns about the circumstances surrounding these amendments. Ellie leaned forward. What kind of concerns? The handwriting analysis on some signatures shows inconsistencies. The witnesses to the final amendments include people with financial relationships to Mrs. Morrison Clark. And several changes were made during appointments that Mr. Clark attended alone without his usual practice of bringing someone he trusted. Catherine's attorney stood abruptly. Are you suggesting impropriety, Mr. Rodriguez? Because I should warn you that making unfounded accusations about a grieving widow. I'm not making accusations, Jake replied calmly. I'm stating facts about irregularities that warrant investigation. Miss Clark, as your father's biological daughter, you have the right to contest this will.
Contest it? Catherine's voice carried the perfect note of hurt confusion. Ellie, surely you can't believe your father would be manipulated about something so important. This is his final statement about our family relationships. But Ellie was studying Jake's face, seeing something there that gave her hope for the first time since she'd discovered the altered photographs. Mr. Rodriguez, she said carefully, are you saying you believe something illegal might have happened? I'm saying that your father was a careful, methodical man who valued family above everything else. The man I knew for 5 years would never have disinherited his daughter without significant cause, and certainly not with language that sounds nothing like his voice. Jake gathered the documents and met Ellie's eyes directly. If you're interested in investigating these irregularities, I'd be willing to help. Pro bono. Catherine's mask finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Ellie, you're being influenced by a lawyer who clearly has his own agenda. Your father's wishes were clear. Maybe it's time to accept that and move forward. But as Ellie looked between Catherine's controlled fury and Jake's steady support, she realized that moving forward meant moving toward the truth, whatever that truth might reveal about the woman who'd systematically erased her from her own family's story. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "I think we need to talk." The Erasure, Part 4, Uncovering the Pattern. Jake's office felt different after hours. Quieter, more intimate. The city lights beyond the windows, creating a sense of conspiracy that notched the gravity of their investigation. Ellie sat across from his desk, surrounded by boxes of her father's legal documents, financial records, and correspondence that Jake had been quietly collecting since David's death. "I've been David's attorney for 5 years," Jake said, pulling out a thick file. "I knew him well enough to recognize when something didn't feel right. The changes to his estate planning weren't just unusual, they were completely out of character." He spread several documents across the desk. "Look at this timeline. 3 years ago, your father's will left 70% of his assets to you, with the remainder going to Catherine and various charities. 2 years ago, that shifted to 50-50. 18 months ago, you were down to 20%, and in the final 6 months, $5,000, Ellie finished bitterly. But here's what's interesting. Jake opened another file. "During this same period, your father was asking me questions about estate planning in cases of elder abuse. He specifically asked about legal protections if someone was manipulating a person's relationships with family members." Ellie's pulse quickened. "He suspected something?" "I think so. But every time I tried to discuss specifics, he'd change the subject or reschedule our meetings. Then Catherine started attending his appointments, saying she was helping him stay organized due to his heart medication affecting his memory." Jake pulled out a manila envelope. "These are copies of correspondence I found in David's business files, letters and cards that were supposedly sent to him, but never reached him." Ellie opened the envelope and felt her breath catch. Birthday cards in her handwriting, Christmas gifts with receipts showing they'd been purchased, but apparently never delivered. Even a sympathy card she'd sent when his business partner retired. All dated over the past 3 years, all bearing return addresses that should have reached him. She was intercepting my mail. Dad thought I'd stopped reaching out. It gets worse. Jake opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. "These are phone records from your father's landline and cell phone. Look at the pattern of calls to and from your number." The record showed a clear progression. 3 years ago, regular calls between Ellie and her father's numbers, some lasting an hour or more. Then the frequency dropped dramatically and the duration shortened. By the final year, there were virtually no calls at all. "But I kept calling," Ellie said, studying the records. "I left voicemails, sent texts, to numbers that may not have been his anymore." Jake pulled up another document. Catherine convinced him to consolidate their phone plans 8 months ago. Your father's original numbers were transferred to a family account that she managed. The implications hit Ellie like a cold wave. She was screening his calls, intercepting messages, and more than that. Jake opened another file. Medical records show that during his final year, your father frequently asked his doctors about you. Dr. Martinez's notes include multiple entries about David wondering why you never called, whether you were angry with him, if he should reach out.
Catherine had been feeding him that narrative while systematically cutting off his actual contact with his daughter. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. "Financial records show unusual activity in your father's accounts during the final months. Large cash withdrawals, changes to automatic payments, transfers to accounts that Catherine had co-signing authority on. He showed her bank statements that painted a picture of increasing financial dependence. Catherine had gradually taken over management of David's day-to-day finances, ostensibly to help him as his health declined. She isolated him, Ellie said, the full scope of the manipulation becoming clear. Physically, emotionally, financially. She made sure I couldn't reach him, then told him my absence proved I didn't care. Classic elder abuse pattern, Jake confirmed. Isolation followed by dependency, with the abuser positioning themselves as the victim's only reliable source of support and information. Ellie's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar. Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Some family secrets are better left buried. She showed Jake the message, watching his expression darken. That's escalation, he said. Someone's watching our investigation. Catherine? Or someone working with her. This level of financial and legal manipulation usually requires inside help. Jake gathered the documents and locked them in his safe. Ellie, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. How far are you willing to go to expose what happened to your father? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Ellie thought about the photos, the intercepted mail, the poisoned relationships, the stolen inheritance. She thought about her father spending his final year believing his daughter had abandoned him. As far as it takes, she said. If Catherine wanted me erased from his life, she succeeded. But if she thinks she can steal his death too, she's wrong. Jake nodded grimly. Then we need to move fast. And we need to be careful. People who go to these lengths to control a narrative don't usually stop at legal manipulation. As they prepared to leave his office, Ellie realized she was no longer just investigating fraud. She was uncovering a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that had stolen final years of her relationship with her father. The question now was whether Catherine's manipulation ended with David's death, or if Ellie herself had become the next target in a game she was only beginning to understand. Ellie's laptop hummed quietly in Jake's conference room as she worked through the night, her graphic designer's expertise finally proving invaluable in ways she'd never imagined. The metadata from the family photos told a story more damning than she'd dared hope. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen where photo properties were displayed in neat columns. "This Christmas photo was last modified on March 15th, 2 years ago, but Christmas was in December, and the original file shows it was taken 3 years ago." Jake leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she caught the scent of his coffee and cologne. Someone went back and edited it months later? Not just edited, surgically altered. See these pixel inconsistencies along the left edge? That's where I was standing next to Dad. The background has been reconstructed to fill the space, but if you know what to look for, you can see the artifacts from the healing brush tool. She pulled up another photo, this one from her father's business computer that Jake had retrieved earlier. Now look at this, the same photo, but the original version. The difference was stark. In the original, Ellie stood next to her father in front of the Christmas tree, both of them grinning as David held up the watch she had given him. In Catherine's version, David stood alone, his arm awkwardly positioned where his daughter should have been. "She's been doing this systematically for years," Ellie continued, scrolling through the metadata analysis. "Every photo that included me has been modified, most of them multiple times as she refined her technique." Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Package delivered to your office as requested, Sarah." "Your friend from Portland?" he asked, noting the sender's name. "Sarah Kim. She's a therapist, but more importantly right now, she's someone I trust completely. I asked her to drive up with some things from my apartment, including backup drives with family photos that Catherine never had access to." 20 minutes later, Sarah arrived carrying a small box and wearing the concerned expression Ellie had seen countless times during their friendship. Sarah was the kind of person who could read emotional manipulation from across a room, which is probably why she never liked Catherine during the few times they had met. "I brought everything you asked for," Sarah said, setting down the box and immediately moving to hug Ellie. "How are you holding up? This sounds absolutely insane." "It is insane, but we're proving it." Ellie opened the box and pulled out several external hard drives. "These have copies of every family photo Dad ever shared with me, plus ones I took myself during visits." As Ellie loaded the photos onto her laptop, Sarah examined the evidence they had already compiled.
Her therapist training had given her particular insight into psychological manipulation tactics, and she studied the patterns with professional interest. This is textbook isolation and gaslighting, Sarah said, reviewing the intercepted correspondence. She didn't just want to control his resources, she needed him to believe that his own perceptions of your relationship were wrong. Look at this, Ellie said, opening a folder of original photos. Here's documentation of every visit I made, every gift I brought, every moment we shared that Catherine claimed never happened.
They identify emotionally vulnerable targets, isolate them from existing support systems, then gradually assume control of their decision-making. Morrison nodded. The complaints all mentioned similar tactics: intercepted mail, controlled communications, gradual alienation from family members. But proving intent has been nearly impossible because the victims genuinely believe they're making their own choices. "What about the medical records?" Ellie asked, remembering Jake's concerns about her father's medication changes. Dad's heart condition medications were adjusted several times in his final months. Morrison's expression darkened as he reviewed David's medical file. "Your father was prescribed a new medication cocktail that can cause confusion and memory issues as side effects. Perfectly legal when prescribed by a doctor, but convenient if you want someone to be more susceptible to manipulation," Jake finished. "Dr. Patterson, who prescribed the changes, happens to be Marcus Webb's brother-in-law," Morrison continued. "He's been investigated twice for inappropriate prescribing practices, but never charged." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming horrifyingly clear. This wasn't just Catherine acting alone, it was a network of professionals working together to systematically exploit vulnerable elderly people. Ellie's phone buzzed with another threatening text. "Last warning, drop the investigation or face consequences you won't recover from." Morrison examined the message. "They're escalating. That suggests desperation." He looked at Ellie seriously. "It also suggests you're in real danger. People who go to these lengths don't usually stop at threats." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Two of the previous complaint cases involved family members who tried to investigate. One had a suspicious car accident. Another suffered a home invasion where nothing was stolen, but their computers and documents were destroyed. Jake gathered the evidence protectively. "We need to move fast, file criminal charges, get protective orders." "Already in motion," Morrison said. "But I need more evidence to make charges stick. Financial records, medical documentation, preferably testimony from someone inside their operation." "The threatening messages prove they're monitoring our investigation," Ellie said. "How are they getting information so quickly?" Morrison pulled up another file. "Marcus Webb has connections throughout the legal and medical community. Former law enforcement contacts, medical professionals, even courthouse staff. They could be getting information from multiple sources." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake's phone rang. His assistant's voice was tight with concern. "Mr. Rodriguez, there are two men here asking about Miss Clark. They say they're private investigators hired by the family, but something feels wrong." Morrison was already moving toward the door. "Keep them busy, we're coming down." But when they reached the lobby, the men were gone. Jake's assistant, visibly shaken, described two well-dressed individuals who'd asked detailed questions about Ellie's whereabouts and the nature of her legal case. They knew too much, details about the will reading, about family dynamics. When I wouldn't give them information, they became insistent. Morrison called for backup and reviewed the building's security footage, but the men had been careful to avoid clear camera angles. They were professionals, and they'd sent a message. Catherine and Marcus knew exactly where to find Ellie and her allies. "We need a safe location for the investigation," Morrison said, "somewhere off the grid while we build the criminal case." But as they prepared to relocate, Jake's phone rang again. This time it was Catherine herself, her voice carrying that familiar blend of concern and manipulation. "Ellie, darling, I've been trying to reach you. Some very disturbing people have been asking questions about our family, spreading terrible rumors about your father's estate. I think someone might be trying to take advantage of your grief to cause trouble." The audacity was breathtaking. Even as she sent threatening messages and private investigators, Catherine was positioning herself as the concerned stepmother protecting Ellie from exploitation.
I know you're upset about the will, but please don't let strangers turn you against your father's memory. He loved you, but he also loved me. Can't we honor that by working together instead of letting lawyers tear our family apart?" Ellie looked at Morrison, who was recording the call. The detective nodded encouragingly. "Catherine," Ellie said carefully, "I think we need to talk, all of us, about what really happened to Dad."
There was a pause, and when Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost its warm veneer. "Some conversations are better left unheard, Ellie. Some truths are too painful for everyone involved." The line went dead, leaving them with the chilling realization that Catherine knew exactly what they discovered and was preparing for war. "She's not just threatening you anymore," Morrison said grimly. "She's threatening to destroy evidence, maybe even eliminate witnesses. We need to move tonight." "They know we're investigating," she said quietly, "and they're planning to stop us." The erasure Part 7, Catherine Strikes Back. The counterattack began at dawn with a knock on Ellie's hotel room door. She'd spent the night at a downtown Seattle hotel under a different name following Detective Morrison's security protocols, but somehow Catherine had found her anyway. Two uniformed police officers stood in the hallway, their expressions professionally neutral but tinged with the particular sympathy reserved for difficult family situations. "Miss Clark, we've received a report of concern for your welfare. Your stepmother contacted us about some erratic behavior following your father's death." Ellie's blood ran cold. "What kind of report?" The older officer consulted his notes. "Mrs. Morrison Clark is worried about your mental state. She says you've been making wild accusations about fraud and manipulation, harassing family friends, and threatening legal action based on what she describes as grief-induced delusions. She also mentioned that you've been staying away from the family home, refusing grief counseling, and becoming increasingly paranoid and hostile toward people who cared about your father." The precision of Catherine's narrative was breathtaking. Every element of Ellie's legitimate investigation had been reframed as evidence of mental instability. The hotel stay became avoidance behavior, the evidence gathering became harassment, the legal consultation became paranoid delusions. "Officers, I can explain. Mrs. Morrison Clark has petitioned for a psychological evaluation. She's concerned that grief might be affecting your judgment, and she wants to make sure you get the help you need." Ellie realized with growing horror that Catherine was trying to have her involuntarily committed. If successful, it would not only silence her investigation, but provide retroactive justification for excluding her from David's estate. Who would believe the accusations of a woman who'd been declared mentally unstable by her own family? "I'd like to call my attorney," Ellie said, keeping her voice steady, despite the panic rising in her throat. "Of course, but we do need you to come with us for evaluation. It's for your own safety." Jake arrived at the hospital facility within an hour, his professional composure barely containing his fury. He'd brought Sarah and Detective Morrison, but the hospital staff was reluctant to discuss details due to patient confidentiality laws. "This is exactly what Catherine wanted," Jake said as they waited in the sterile hospital lobby. "Even if the evaluation clears Ellie, the mere fact that she was brought in for mental health assessment will undermine her credibility in court." Morrison was working his phone, trying to expedite the process through law enforcement channels. "She's not just trying to discredit Ellie, she's threatening to destroy evidence, maybe even eliminate witnesses." While Ellie underwent psychological evaluation, Catherine was busy orchestrating the next phase of her campaign. By noon, local news outlets were running stories about a family estate dispute involving accusations of elder abuse and fraud. Catherine had positioned herself as the reasonable party trying to protect a dead man's legacy from his disturbed daughter. The news coverage was masterfully crafted. Catherine appeared on camera as the dignified widow expressing concern for Ellie's mental health while defending David's final wishes. She produced character witnesses, Dr. Martinez, family friends, business associates, all testifying to David's happiness in his final years and his disappointment in his daughter's absence. "Ellie's grieving," Catherine told the reporters, her voice perfectly modulated to convey both sadness and maternal concern. "I understand that losing a parent can cause people to look for someone to blame, but David's wishes were clear and I won't let anyone, even his daughter, tarnish his memory with false accusations." The story painted Ellie as the classic ungrateful child, trying to overturn her father's will through spurious fraud chains after years of neglecting him. Catherine's supporter spoke about David's frequent sadness over Ellie's absence, his hope that she would eventually come home, and his relief at finding love and companionship with Catherine. Jake watched the news coverage from the hospital waiting room, realizing that Catherine had spent years preparing for this moment. Every manipulated conversation, every intercepted letter, every poisoned relationship had built toward this narrative of the abandoned father and the money-hungry daughter. But the most devastating blow came when Dr. Martinez held his own press conference, flanked by other medical professionals who treated David in his final years. "I've known the Clark family for decades," Dr. Martinez said, his voice heavy with apparent regret. "David was a devoted father who never stopped hoping for reconciliation with his daughter. But as his physician, I witnessed the emotional toll that Ellie's absence took on his health." The doctor produced medical records carefully selected to support Catherine's narrative, showing David's documented depression and anxiety during periods when he hadn't heard from Ellie. What the records didn't show were the intercepted communications that had prevented contact in the first place. "Mr. Clark's decision to leave his estate to his wife reflects his reality in those final years," Dr. Martinez continued. "Catherine provided the emotional support and daily care that his daughter unfortunately did not." Sarah, watching the press conference, recognized the sophisticated manipulation tactics at work. "She's not just discrediting Ellie, she's rewriting history in real time. Everyone who speaks up for Catherine becomes complicit in the narrative, making it harder for them to admit they were wrong later." The psychological evaluation concluded that Ellie was grieving but mentally competent, allowing her release after 6 hours. But the damage was done. By evening, social media was buzzing about the greedy daughter trying to steal from her father's widow. Catherine's version of events had become the accepted truth. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, had been busy with more direct intimidation. Jake's law office was burglarized that night, nothing obviously stolen, but files had been searched and computers accessed. The message was clear. They knew what evidence existed and where to find it. When Jake called Detective Morrison about the break-in, he discovered that Morrison himself was facing internal pressure to drop the investigation. "Someone with influence is making calls," Morrison explained. "Questions about my judgment, suggestions that I'm being manipulated by a grieving daughter into pursuing a vendetta against an innocent widow." The web of influence that Marcus Webb had cultivated over the years was activating. Professional relationships, political connections, and financial obligations were being called in to protect the conspiracy from exposure. By the end of the day, Ellie found herself isolated in ways she hadn't imagined possible. The media portrayed her as mentally unstable and financially motivated, medical professionals questioned her version of events, law enforcement was being pressured to abandon the investigation, even some of her own friends, influenced by the constant media coverage, were beginning to wonder if grief had affected her judgment. Catherine's counterattack was working exactly as planned. She turned Ellie's greatest strength, her determination to seek truth, truth into evidence of instability and greed. But as Ellie sat in Jake's apartment that night, reviewing the evidence they'd compiled, she realized that Catherine had made one crucial mistake. In her desperation to discredit Ellie quickly, she'd moved too fast and too aggressively. The psychological evaluation, the media blurts, the professional pressure, it all pointed to someone with significant resources and influence working very hard to silence a supposedly delusional woman. If I were really just a grieving daughter making false accusations, Ellie said to Jake and Sarah, why would Catherine need this level of firepower to stop me? The question would prove more prophetic than any of them realized. Catherine's overwhelming response to their investigation was about to provide the very evidence they needed to expose the truth if they could survive long enough to use it. The second attempt to have Ellie committed came at 3 a.m., this time with a court order signed by an emergency judge. Catherine had produced new evidence, forged text messages supposedly from Ellie threatening self-harm, fabricated witness statements about erratic behavior, and a psychiatric report from a doctor Ellie had never met claiming she was a danger to herself and others. Jake intercepted the emergency medical team at his apartment building, where Ellie had been staying since the break-in at his office. His legal training kicked in as he examined the paperwork, but the court order appeared legitimate, signed by Judge Harrison, who, Jake discovered with sinking dread, was Marcus Webb's golf partner. This is a 72-hour hold, the lead EMT explained apologetically. We don't have discretion. If someone's been deemed a threat to themselves, we have to transport. Ellie sat on Jake's couch in her pajamas, watching her world collapse with eerie calm. The systematic destruction of her credibility, the corruption of every institution that should have protected her, the weaponization of mental health laws, it was all exactly what Catherine had planned from the beginning. She's going to destroy the evidence while I'm locked up, she said quietly. By the time I get out, there won't be anything left to prove. But Sarah, who'd been making calls while Jake reviewed the legal documents, hung up with an expression of grim determination. Not if we go public first. I've been in contact with investigative journalist Rebecca Chen at the Seattle Times. She specializes in elder abuse cases, and she's interested in your story. The media already thinks I'm delusional, Ellie replied. Catherine's controlled that narrative perfectly. Rebecca's different. She knows how these scams work, and she's been tracking similar cases across the Pacific Northwest. Sarah pulled out her phone. She wants to meet with us right now before they can take you away. Jake looked at the court order again, noting the timing. This was expedited through emergency channels at 2 a.m. on a Saturday. That's not normal procedure. Someone pulled significant strings to make this happen so quickly. Rebecca Chen met them at an all-night diner near the hospital, bringing a recorder and a thick file of documents. She was younger than Ellie had expected, maybe 35, with the intense focus of someone who'd built her career on exposing corruption. I've been investigating Marcus Webb for 2 years, Rebecca said without preamble. Your case fits a pattern I've been documenting. Wealthy elderly victims, systematic isolation, fraudulent estate changes, and aggressive silencing of family members who ask questions. She opened her file to reveal photographs, financial records, and testimonials from other families who'd lost inheritances under similar circumstances. Webb and his network have stolen an estimated $15 million over the past decade, but they've been protected by their connections in the legal and medical communities. Network? Jake asked. At least 12 people, financial advisors, doctors, judges, and even a few lawyers. They target recently widowed, wealthy individuals, introduce romantic partners or caregivers who gradually assume control, then restructure estates while discrediting family members who object. Rebecca showed them an organizational chart that made Ellie's blood run cold. Catherine and Marcus were at the center, but the web extended to include Dr. Martinez, Judge Harrison, and several other professionals who'd been involved in David's final months. The psychiatric holds are their nuclear option, Rebecca continued. When family members get too close to exposing the truth, they use mental health laws to silence them. 2 previous victims' children were institutionalized on false pretenses while evidence was destroyed. But you're going to publish this? Ellie asked, hope flickering for the first time in days. Tonight. Online first, then in tomorrow's print edition, but I need your story on record before they can take you away. For the next hour, Ellie recounted everything: the erased photos, the intercepted communications, the systematic manipulation of her father's perceptions. Rebecca recorded it all while Jake provided legal documentation and Sarah offered professional analysis of the psychological manipulation tactics. There's one more thing, Rebecca said as they finished. I've been in contact with the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force. They've been building a case against this network, but they needed someone on the inside willing to go on record. She handed Ellie a business card. Agent Sandra Kim, no relation to your friend Sarah. She wants to offer you federal protection in exchange for your cooperation with their investigation. The irony wasn't lost on Ellie. Catherine's aggressive tactics, designed to silence her quickly, had actually attracted the attention of federal investigators who'd been looking for a way into the conspiracy. As they left the diner, Jake's phone rang with news that would change everything. His private investigator had finally gained access to David's safe deposit box, a box that Catherine apparently didn't know existed. Your father left a video message, the investigator reported, recorded 3 weeks before he died.
You need to see this immediately. They drove to the bank as dawn broke over Seattle, Ellie's court-ordered psychiatric hold temporarily forgotten in the rush to uncover what her father had left behind. The safe deposit box contained documents, personal items, and a small digital camera with a single video file. David Clark's face appeared on Jake's laptop screen, thinner than Ellie remembered, but unmistakably her father. He was sitting in his business office, speaking directly to the camera with the deliberate cadence of someone making an important statement. If anyone is watching this, it means I'm gone, and I'm hoping my daughter Ellie has found this box. Ellie, if it's you, I need you to know that everything Catherine has told people about our relationship is a lie. Ellie's breath caught as her father's voice continued, clear and lucid despite his illness. Catherine has been intercepting your letters,
blocking your phone calls, and telling me that you don't want to see me anymore. I know better. I know my daughter, and I know you wouldn't abandon me. But she's been very convincing to everyone else. The video showed David holding up some of the intercepted letters and gifts, his expression mixing sadness with determination. I've been pretending to go along with her manipulation because I suspect she's planning something terrible. I've hidden copies of important documents in this box, including evidence of how she and Marcus Webb have been changing my financial arrangements without my real consent. David's voice grew stronger as he continued. I'm recording this because I'm afraid Catherine might try to have me declared incompetent or worse. I want everyone to know that I love my daughter, that I never stopped wanting her in my life, and that any will leaving her only a token amount is not my true intention. He held up a handwritten document. This is my real will, written in my own hand, leaving 70% of my estate to Ellie and 30% to charity. The other documents in this box prove that Catherine and Marcus have been systematically defrauding me and isolating me from my family. As the video ended, David looked directly into the camera with an expression of profound sadness and love. Ellie, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop this while I was alive, but I hope this evidence helps you get justice and reclaim what's rightfully yours. I love you, sweetheart. I never stopped loving you. The recording concluded with a timestamp showing it was made just 3 weeks before David's death, well after Catherine claimed he'd lost mental capacity due to his medications. Jake, Sarah, and Ellie sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. David had known about the conspiracy, had gathered evidence, and had deliberately documented his true feelings about his daughter and his estate. This changes everything, Jake said quietly. This proves competency, documents the fraud, and provides testimony from beyond the grave. But even as relief flooded through Ellie, she realized they were in a race against time. Catherine and Marcus would soon discover that their emergency psychiatric hold had failed to silence her, and they'd escalate to even more desperate measures. The video was powerful evidence, but only if they could stay alive enough to use it. Rebecca Chen's story would break in hours, federal investigators were ready to move, and David's testimony provided the evidence they needed. But Catherine had spent years building her network of corruption, and cornered predators were often most dangerous when facing exposure. As they prepared to take David's evidence to the authorities, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The Erasure, Part 9, The Trial of Truth. Judge Patricia Hawkins' courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathered outside and media trucks lining the street. Rebecca Chen's exposé had transformed what began as a private family dispute into a public examination of elder abuse, systematic fraud, and the vulnerability of grief-stricken families to predatory manipulation. Ellie sat at the plaintiff's table beside Jake, acutely aware of the cameras and the weight of public scrutiny. Across the aisle, Catherine maintained her perfectly composed facade, though stress lines had begun to show around her eyes. Marcus Webb sat with his own legal team, his smooth confidence replaced by the careful neutrality of someone trying to minimize exposure. Your Honor, Jake began in his opening statement, this case is about more than inheritance fraud. It's about the systematic erasure of a daughter's relationship with her father through calculated psychological warfare designed to justify theft on a massive scale. He gestured toward a presentation screen where David's video testimony would soon play. The evidence will show that Catherine Morrison Clark and Marcus Webb orchestrated a multi-year conspiracy to isolate David Clark from his daughter, manipulate his perceptions of their relationship, and steal his estate through forged documents and fraudulent legal proceedings. Catherine's attorney, Victoria Sterling, responded with a performance worthy of her reputation. Your Honor, we're here because a grieving daughter refuses to accept her father's final wishes. Mr. Clark was a competent adult who made conscious decisions about his estate based on years of disappointment in his daughter's behavior. She produced a thick folder of documentation. The evidence will show that Eleanor Clark systematically distanced herself from her father, causing him emotional distress that was documented by multiple medical professionals. Her current accusations are the desperate actions of someone who realizes too late that actions have consequences. But when Judge Hawkins called for the first piece of evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Jake stood and announced, "Your Honor, we'd like to present video testimony from David Clark himself, recorded 3 weeks before his death." Catherine's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of panic quickly covered by confusion. "Your Honor," Victoria Sterling objected, "we have no record of any such video, and its authenticity cannot be verified." "The video was discovered in Mr. Clark's private safe deposit box," Jake replied. "We have chain of custody documentation and are prepared to provide technical analysis confirming its authenticity." David Clark's face appeared on the courtroom's large screen, and a hush fell over the packed gallery. For the next 12 minutes, Ellie's father systematically dismantled every aspect of Catherine's narrative. His voice was clear, his manner deliberate, and his mental acuity undeniable. "Catherine has been intercepting my daughter's letters and phone calls," he stated directly to the camera. "She's told me that Ellie doesn't want to see me, while telling others that Ellie has abandoned me." Both statements are lies, designed to justify her gradual takeover of my life and finances. The impact was immediately and devastating. Spectators murmured, reporters scribbled frantically, and Catherine's face had gone pale as her primary defense crumbled in real time. David's testimony continued with specific examples of manipulation, including dates when Catherine claimed Ellie had failed to call while showing intercepted voicemails from that same day. He displayed birthday cards and gifts that Catherine had hidden, proving ongoing contact that contradicted her narrative of abandonment. "I'm recording this because I believe Catherine and her associate Marcus Webb are planning to have me declared incompetent or worse. I want everyone to know that I love my daughter, that I never stopped wanting her in my life, and that any will leaving her only a token amount is not my true intention." He held up a handwritten document. "This is my real will, written in my own hand, leaving 70% of my estate to Ellie and 30% to charity. The other documents in this box prove that Catherine and Marcus have been systematically defrauding me and isolating me from my family." As the video ended, David looked directly into the camera with an expression of profound sadness and love. "Ellie, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop this while I was alive, but I hope this evidence helps you get justice and reclaim what's rightfully yours. I love you, sweetheart. I never stopped loving you." The recording concluded with a timestamp showing it was made just 3 weeks before David's death, well after Catherine claimed he'd lost mental capacity due to his medications. Jake, Sarah, and Ellie sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. David had known about the conspiracy, had gathered evidence, and had deliberately documented his true feelings about his daughter and his estate. "This changes everything," Jake said quietly. "This proves competency, documents the fraud, and provides testimony from beyond the grave."
Rebecca Chen testified about her investigation, revealing the network of corrupted professionals who'd enabled years of systematic theft. Sarah Kim provided expert testimony about psychological manipulation tactics, walking the jury through the specific techniques Catherine had used to isolate David and control his perceptions. Her clinical analysis of the intercepted communications and documented behavior patterns painted a picture of calculated psychological abuse. But it was Dr. Martinez's testimony that provided the most dramatic moment of the trial. Called as a witness for Catherine's defense, he began with the standard narrative about David's disappointment in his daughter. Then, Jake began his cross-examination. "Dr. Martinez, were you aware that Mr. Clark's medications were changed multiple times in his final months by Dr. Patterson, who happens to be Marcus Webb's brother-in-law?" Yes, Dr. Patterson consulted on the case due to his expertise in cardiac medications." "Were you aware that these medication changes can cause confusion and increase susceptibility to suggestion?" Dr. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Some side effects are possible, but Mr. Clark seemed mentally competent during our visits." Jake played a recording from David's medical file, his own voice asking Dr. Martinez why his daughter never called anymore, expressing confusion about their relationship. The recording was timestamped on the same day Ellie had left 3 voicemails that Catherine had intercepted. Dr. Martinez, if Mr. Clark was asking you about his daughter's absence on the same day she was actually trying to reach him, doesn't that suggest someone was manipulating his access to information? The doctor's composure finally cracked. I was told by Mrs. Morrison Clark that Miss Clark was avoiding her father. I had no reason to doubt. So you based your medical opinions about a patient's family relationships on information provided by someone who, as we now know, was systematically intercepting that family's communications? The admission rippled through the courtroom. One of Catherine's key supporters had just acknowledged that his testimony was based on Catherine's manipulated narrative rather than direct observation. Marcus Webb's attorney attempted damage control by having his client take the stand to deny any criminal intent. But Jake's cross-examination revealed the sophisticated nature of their operation, including the network of corrupt professionals and the systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly clients. Mr. Webb, how do you explain that 5 of your estate planning clients in the past decade have died within months of dramatically changing their wills to favor caregivers or romantic partners? Estate planning for elderly clients naturally involves end-of-life considerations. And how do you explain that in each case, the deceased children complained about intercepted communications and manipulated family relationships? Marcus's smooth confidence finally abandoned him as he struggled to provide explanations that didn't incriminate him further. His admission that he'd worked with Dr. Patterson on medication adjustments for anxious elderly clients provided the final link in the conspiracy chain. Catherine's own testimony was a masterclass in manipulation that ultimately served to convict her. She maintained her grieving widow persona while defending every action as motivated by love for David and concern for his well-being. But when confronted with David's video testimony and the intercepted communications, her explanations became increasingly convoluted and defensive. Mrs. Morrison Clark, Jake asked during cross-examination, if you truly believed Mr. Clark's daughter had abandoned him, why did you feel the need to intercept her letters and phone calls? I was protecting David from further disappointment. By preventing him from receiving evidence that his daughter still loved him? Catherine's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. Some people need protection from their own poor judgment, she snapped before catching herself. But it was too late. The jury had seen the real Catherine Morrison Clark, not the grieving widow, but the manipulative predator who viewed David's love for his daughter as an obstacle to overcome rather than a relationship to respect. Judge Hawkins' verdict was swift and comprehensive. The fraudulent will was invalidated, David's handwritten testament was upheld, and criminal charges were recommended for Catherine, Marcus, Dr. Patterson, and Judge Harrison. The conspiracy that had stolen millions from vulnerable elderly victims was finally exposed and dismantled. As the gavel fell, Ellie felt not triumph, but exhaustion. Justice had been served, but nothing could restore the final years of her relationship with her father that Catherine's manipulation had stolen. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Ellie spoke about her father's legacy and the importance of protecting vulnerable elderly people from predatory manipulation. But privately, she was already thinking about what came next, how to rebuild from the ashes of Catherine's systematic erasure and create something positive from the pain. The Erasure, Part 10, Rebuilding Identity. 6 months after the trial, Ellie stood in her father's study, her study now, looking out at the garden where her mother's roses had finally been replanted. The house felt different with Catherine's cold modernization stripped away and replaced with warmth that honored both her parents' memories. Family photos lined the mantel again, but now they included both the original images and new ones documenting the healing process. The transformation hadn't been easy. Beyond the legal victory, Ellie had faced the harder task of rebuilding her identity after years of systematic erasure. Therapy with Sarah's colleague had helped her process not just the grief for her father, but the complex trauma of having her entire existence questioned and nearly destroyed. The quarterly reports look good, Jake said, entering the study with a stack of documents. He'd officially joined Clark Import-Export as general counsel, bringing his legal expertise to a business that Ellie was rebuilding from the ground up.
Their professional partnership had evolved naturally into something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than crisis bonding. Better than good, Ellie replied, reviewing the numbers. We're not just recovering, we're thriving. The business had suffered during David's final years as Catherine and Marcus had gradually diverted resources and alienated key clients. But with the truth exposed and Ellie's fresh perspective, old relationships had been restored and new opportunities had emerged. Several former employees who'd been pushed out during Catherine's influence had returned, bringing institutional knowledge and renewed loyalty. "There's something else," Jake said, his tone shifting to the gentle formality he used for sensitive matters. "The Clark Foundation received another application today. A family in Portland whose elderly father was recently remarried to a woman who's already started isolating him from his children." The Clark Foundation for Elder Protection had been Ellie's first major initiative after reclaiming her inheritance. Using her father's resources and her own painful experience, she'd created an organization dedicated to identifying and preventing the kind of systematic abuse that had destroyed her family's final years. The foundation provided legal assistance, investigative services, and psychological support for families facing similar situations. "How many does that make this month?" Ellie asked, though she already knew the answer would be sobering. 12. And that's just the ones who found us and been brave enough to reach out. The scope of elder abuse had shocked even the professionals working in the field. Catherine and Marcus's network had been just one of many operating across the country, targeting vulnerable elderly people with sophisticated manipulation techniques. The foundation's work had revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that suggested organized operations specifically designed to exploit grief and isolation. "Dr. Chen called this morning," Jake continued, referring to the forensic psychiatrist they'd brought on as a consultant. "She's identified what she thinks might be another network operating in California. 3 families with eerily similar stories: sudden estrangement from elderly parents, new romantic partners who immediately gained financial control, and aggressive legal tactics against questioning family members." Ellie nodded, making notes on her tablet. The foundation's investigative work had already helped expose 2 additional fraud rings and had contributed to new legislation strengthening protections for elderly people against financial manipulation. But each victory revealed the magnitude of a problem that extended far beyond individual cases. "The memorial service preparations are almost complete," Sarah said, joining them in the study. She'd relocated to Seattle to serve as the foundation's clinical director, bringing her expertise in psychological manipulation to help other families understand and combat the tactics used against their loved ones. Tomorrow marked the first anniversary of David's death, but instead of the private grief Ellie had expected to face, it would be a celebration of his life and legacy. The David Clark Memorial Service had grown beyond family remembrance into a community event highlighting elder protection advocacy and the importance of maintaining family connections despite predatory interference. "The speakers are confirmed," Sarah continued. "Detective Morrison will discuss law enforcement approaches to elder abuse. Rebecca Chen will talk about the media's role in exposing these crimes, and Judge Hawkins will address legal reforms." But the centerpiece would be David's own voice. Ellie had decided to play portions of his video testimony publicly for the first time, letting her father speak directly about the importance of family bonds and the dangers of manipulation. It felt like the completion of his final message, not just to her, but to anyone facing similar threats. Jake's phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. "The clemency petition was denied," he said quietly. "Catherine will serve her full 15-year sentence." Catherine had been convicted on multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy, while Marcus received 12 years and Dr. Patterson had lost his medical license in addition to a 5-year sentence. Judge Harrison had been impeached and faced separate criminal charges. The network's systematic theft had been estimated at over $20 million across dozens of victims. "Good," Ellie said simply. "Some people deserved forgiveness, others deserved consequences." As evening approached, Ellie walked through the house that had once felt like a museum of someone else's life. Now it felt like home again, not the home of her childhood, but something new built on the foundation of truth and memory. The living room displayed photos spanning 3 generations, including recent pictures of Ellie and Jape, Sarah and her partner, and the extended family that had been slowly reconnecting after years of Catherine's manipulation.
The dining room table where she'd felt like a stranger at her father's funeral now hosted weekly dinners for foundation staff, survivors of elder abuse, and anyone else who needed a place where their stories would be believed and their experiences validated. In the kitchen, Ellie found a handwritten note from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who'd become an unexpected ally. "Dear Ellie, I wanted you to know that your father would be so proud of what you've built from this tragedy. Love doesn't end with death. It transforms into legacy." Standing in the garden as sunset painted the sky, Ellie reflected on the year that had changed everything. Catherine had tried to erase her from her father's life and steal her identity, but the truth had a persistence that manipulation couldn't overcome. David's love had survived even systematic attempts to destroy it, and his final gift hadn't just been his estate, it had been the evidence needed to protect other families from similar predators. Jake joined her on the garden bench, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the roses bloom. They were different varieties than her mother had planted. These were stronger, more resilient, chosen specifically for their ability to thrive after trauma. "Do you think he knows?" Jake asked quietly. "About what you've built, what you've accomplished?" Ellie considered the question, thinking about the foundation's work, the families they'd helped, the legislation they'd influenced, and the simple fact that love had ultimately proven stronger than manipulation. "I think he always knew," she said finally. "The video he left wasn't just evidence, it was faith. Faith that truth would survive, that love would endure, and that his daughter would find a way to transform pain into purpose." As stars began to appear overhead, Ellie realized that Catherine's greatest failure hadn't been getting caught. It had been fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of family bonds. Love wasn't a resource to be controlled or a narrative to be rewritten. It was a force that had attempts at destruction, emerging stronger and more determined to protect others from similar harm.
The contrast was devastating. Ellie's archive showed a loving father-daughter relationship that had continued right up until Catherine's manipulation campaign intensified. Birthday dinners, holiday celebrations, casual visits where David looked genuinely happy to see his daughter, all of it contradicting the narrative of abandonment and ingratitude that Catherine had constructed. But it was Jake who made the most significant discovery while examining Catherine's computer files they'd subpoenaed. "Ellie, you need to see this," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He'd opened an email folder labeled Project Management, innocuous enough to avoid suspicion, but containing exchanges that made their blood run cold. The emails were between Catherine and someone identified only as M. Webb, with timestamps spanning the past 2 years. Catherine: "David asked about E again today. Need to accelerate timeline on perception management." M. Webb: "Insurance beneficiary changes are complete. Suggest increasing medical isolation protocols." Catherine: "Photo project nearly finished. Family narrative will be clean by end of quarter." M. Webb: "Estate restructuring finalized. Subject believes daughter's absence confirms worst assumptions about relationship." "They're talking about my father like he's a business project," Ellie whispered, scrolling through dozens of similar exchanges. "Subject? Perception management? Timeline?" Sarah read over her shoulder, her therapist training helping her decode the clinical language. "This isn't just elder abuse. This is systematic psychological manipulation with financial motives. They were deliberately destroying his relationship with you to justify stealing his estate." The final email in the chain was dated just 2 weeks before David's death. M. Webb: "Medical situation provides a natural conclusion to project. All documentation in place for a clean transition." Catherine: "Confirmed. E's narrative complete. Financial transfer should proceed without legal challenges." "They were planning for his death," Jake said grimly. "This suggests they may have known about his medical crisis before it happened." Ellie stared at the screen, feeling sick. The clinical precision of the language, the casual references to her father's life and death as project management, painted a picture of Catherine not as a grieving widow, but as a calculating predator who'd spent years orchestrating David's isolation and financial exploitation. "Who is M. Webb?" Sarah asked. Jake was already pulling up corporate records on his other computer. "Marcus Webb.
He's a financial planner who's worked with several of Catherine's interior design clients. Looks like he specializes in estate planning for wealthy older adults. Her partner, Ellie said, understanding Dawn. She's done this before. The evidence was overwhelming now. Not just the photo manipulation and intercepted communications, but documentation of a deliberate conspiracy to isolate her father and steal his estate. The casual tone of the emails suggested this was routine business for both Catherine and Marcus, a practiced operation they'd refined over time. We need to contact law enforcement. This has moved beyond civil fraud into potential criminal territory. But Ellie was staring at the most recent email in the folder, sent just yesterday. M. E's investigation is creating complications. Recommend immediate intervention before legal discovery expands. Catherine. Agreed. Time to activate contingency protocols.